Once upon a time, in a bustling city filled with the hum of languages and cultures, there lived a young man named Arvin. Arvin had always dreamed of speaking English fluently. He had heard it spoken everywhere around him, on TV, in movies, in business meetings, and even in the cafes where he often sat. But for years he had struggled with it. The grammar confused him, the vocabulary was overwhelming, and he felt discouraged by his lack of progress. He had tried learning English in school, through apps, and even with tutors, but nothing seemed to work. One afternoon, after yet another disappointing session with his language learning app, Arvin was sitting in a coffee shop when he overheard a conversation between two tourists. They were speaking English fluidly, and Arvin couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. "I wish I could speak like that," he thought. Then, in a flash of inspiration, he thought, what if I could learn English in 5 days? What if I could immerse myself in it completely, no distractions, no excuses? And so, a plan began to form. Day 1, the foundation, start with the basics. Arvin woke up early the next morning with one thought: immersion. If he was going to learn English in 5 days, he needed to surround himself with it. No distractions, no excuses. He started with the basics. Step 1, vocabulary and phrases. Arvin opened his phone and downloaded a language learning app that emphasized vocabulary acquisition through repetition. He focused on essential words and phrases. He began by learning greetings, common expressions, and the most frequently used verbs and adjectives in everyday conversations. Words like hello, thank you, sorry, and please became his focus. He made flashcards, wrote them down on a piece of paper, and stuck them around his room, on the walls, and on his bathroom mirror. Arvin spent 2 hours memorizing these words, repeating them aloud over and over, until they felt familiar to him. He was determined to get them right. Whenever he encountered a new word, he wrote it down, pronounced it, and used it in a simple sentence. By the end of the day, Arvin had learned over 100 essential words and phrases. Step 2, listening and pronunciation. The next step was listening. Arvin knew that listening to native speakers would help him develop an ear for the language. He spent the entire day watching English language videos, not just passive viewing, but active listening. He chose TED Talks, news reports, and YouTube videos where English was spoken clearly and slowly. He repeated what he heard, mimicking the pronunciation, the rhythm, and the intonation. He recorded himself speaking and compared it to the original speakers. Arvin spent hours practicing pronunciation, making sure he enunciated each word clearly. By the end of the day, his confidence in his speaking ability had grown, even though he knew it was just the beginning. Day 2, building momentum, deep dive into grammar and structure. Arvin woke up feeling motivated. He had made significant progress, but he knew he had to deepen his understanding. Day 2 would be dedicated to grammar and sentence structure. He wasn't going to get bogged down by rules, but he did need to learn the framework that would allow him to speak correctly. Step 1. Basic sentence construction. Arvin started by learning how to form simple sentences. He used the vocabulary he'd learned on day 1 to create sentences like I am happy, you are my friend, and she likes to eat apples. He learned about subject-verb-object, SVO, word order, which is the foundation of English sentence structure. He practiced combining different sentence structures, from positive to negative and interrogative sentences. He used basic verbs like to be, to have, and to go. He also practiced using simple conjunctions such as and, but, and because to connect his thoughts. Step 2. Grammar Basics. Arvin then focused on essential grammar rules. He learned about present simple tense for regular actions and routines, past simple tense for things that happened in the past, and future simple tense for plans and predictions. He took notes, practiced forming questions and answers, and did exercises online. He also learned about plural forms, articles, a versus the, and prepositions, in, on, at. Even though grammar was sometimes difficult, Arvin was determined not to let it overwhelm him. He gave himself short, frequent breaks and returned to the lessons with a fresh mind. By the end of the day, he felt confident enough to make more complex sentences. Step 3. Conversational practice. To wrap up the day, Arvin used a language exchange app to practice speaking with a native English speaker. It wasn't perfect. He stumbled, made mistakes, and felt embarrassed at times, but his partner was patient, and they laughed together. The key was communication, not perfection. He finished the day feeling a sense of accomplishment, knowing that he was already capable of forming full sentences and holding simple conversations. Day 3. Pushing boundaries. Practice makes perfect. Arvin knew that day 3 was about pushing his limits. He had learned the basics, but now he needed to practice more intensely. The goal was not just to memorize, but to apply his knowledge in real situations. Step 1. Listening and imitation. Arvin started the day by listening to podcasts and audiobooks in English, but this time, he didn't just listen passively. He actively repeated what he heard, shadowing the speaker's pronunciation and intonation as closely as possible. This process, known as shadowing, helped him improve his accent and fluency. He also practiced transcribing short English conversations. He would listen to a short exchange, write down what was said, and then compare it with the original script. This exercise not only improved his listening but also reinforced his grammar and vocabulary. Step 2. Real-life situations. Arvin knew that in order to make real progress, he had to simulate real-life situations. So, he went to a local coffee shop and ordered his drink entirely in English. He used the phrases he had learned and, although it was a small interaction, it boosted his confidence. Later, he went to the park and started speaking to strangers in English, asking simple questions like, "How are you?" and "What's your name?" It wasn't easy, but every interaction made him feel more comfortable with the language. By the end of the day, Arvin had faced his fear of speaking in English in public, and he was beginning to see the true power of immersion. Day 4, Refining Skills, Mastering Fluency. Arvin was now entering the final stretch of his 5-day journey, and Day 4 was all about refining his skills. Step 1. Reading and Writing Practice. Arvin knew that to be a truly fluent English speaker, he had to expand his vocabulary and improve his ability to read and write in English. He dedicated the morning to reading. He started with short articles, stories, and even children's books in English. The goal was not to understand every word but to get the general meaning of the text. He also practiced writing short essays, emails, and diary entries in English. Writing allowed him to express his thoughts more clearly, and it forced him to pay attention to grammar and vocabulary. Step 2. Real Conversations. In the afternoon, Arvin met a friend who was a native English speaker. They spoke only in English for 2 hours. It was difficult at first, and Arvin felt his brain struggling to keep up. But as time passed, his fluency started to improve. He could form sentences faster, think in English more easily, and even catch mistakes in his own speech. By the evening, Arvin was exhausted but proud. He had pushed himself beyond his limits and had improved significantly. Day 5, the final test, Confidence and Consistency. On the final day, Arvin focused on confidence. He was no longer intimidated by the idea of speaking English. He had come so far in just 5 days, and now it was time to test his skills in a more advanced way. Step 1. Deep Conversation. He set up a video call with a fluent English speaker and engaged in a deep, meaningful conversation. The topics ranged from politics to culture to personal experiences. Arvin didn't rely on notes or prepared sentences. He spoke freely, using the language he had absorbed over the past 5 days. The conversation was challenging, but it was also exhilarating. Arvin realized that, while he still had a lot to learn, he had made tremendous progress. Step 2. Review and Reflection. Arvin ended the day by reviewing everything he had learned. He reflected on his journey and the progress he had made in such a short time. He still had room to improve, but he was no longer intimidated by the language. He was no longer afraid of making mistakes. The conclusion. Arvin had managed to learn the basics of English in just 5 days through dedication, immersion, and practice. While fluency wasn't achieved in such a short time, he had laid a solid foundation. He had learned to speak confidently, listen attentively, and engage in meaningful conversations. But most importantly, he had learned that learning a language was not about perfection, it was about consistency, patience, and practice. As he walked into the coffee shop the next day and greeted the barista with a confident good morning, Arvin knew this was just the beginning of his English learning journey.